Thank you so much for being here on a Saturday in Paris when you could be anywhere in this marvelous city. My name is Meg Young. I am a senior researcher at Data and Society. I'll be telling you a little bit more about our organization and some framing remarks before I bring up this exciting plenary panel of selections that were made by myself and my colleague Susan Aronson, who's at George Washington University. Before I get started, I wanted to convey how much work Tim and Pierre have done. This entire event was conceived by Tim. He approached the programming committee to see if they were willing to collaborate. He came to us at Data and Society asking to partner. He created a Google Sheet and then code on top of the Google Sheet to elicit every single one of your submissions, create reviewer infrastructure, compile all of our reviews, reports, and it's been phenomenal to see his work as an organizer. So if you get a moment today, please just say a warm thanks to Tim and to Pierre, who in a city that is inundated by different civil society requests for space, fought for us to be able to host us here at the extremely renowned Sciences Po University and to be able to connect us with the incredible group of researchers on this campus. So just a quick thanks to them both. Whatever amount of work I just conveyed, double it, and we're getting close. Okay, so I also want to say thanks to the Volunteer Corps. This is a scrappy, come as you are event today, and it wouldn't be possible without the volunteers, so thank you, volunteers. With this opportunity to address a group of people that I think of as peers and colleagues in this common project of participatory AI, I've been thinking a lot about what do I want to convey? What are the chief goals of this talk? And I wanted to check in about our intellectual history and to ask, uh, what are we pulling from when we are doing participatory AI? Do we think of ourselves as in the lineage of participatory action research and computer or community-based participatory research? Are we thinking instead about the participatory design tradition in HCI? Are you a political philosopher who's thinking often about democratic theory? And for me, it's not important to reconcile these different strains within our traditions, but instead to ask the questions so that we can pull through all the lessons learned from many decades of intentional participatory research and adapt them for AI, because there's so much more that we can learn from and use instead of remaking anew for this new class of technologies. Personally, I look to participatory action research as a resource, and those of you here might already be familiar with its strong commitment to shifting who's making decisions, for thinking about community empowerment as a main goal of participatory action research. And a question that I often ask myself is how much is that sitting in tension with the kinds of artifacts that we work with in our field, with big tech companies and with the artifacts of AI and data science and data centers? Is there a tension between that power shifting and technology, or how might we still find a way to distribute and disaggregate power with technical artifacts? At Data and Society, we've been thinking about this a lot. If you haven't heard of our organization, we're a nonprofit based in the US. We do research, have academic roots, but we really think about the public and policy as our main audiences. And we have dug in on participatory methods. So I was originally hired as the participatory methods researcher. It's in our strategy. Anya here helped push that, and it means that it really is seeded through multiple parts of our research and policy work. I've been doing pilot projects on it, and we originally got to meet many of you through a series that we were programming on participatory methods in AI. And if you're feeling excited about that, we are sitting in the culmination of that sort of conversation. It's grown, and now all of us are part of it. We also created something called the Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab, because in a world where there aren't that many um, mandates for participation, we were looking around and seeing that the algorithmic impact assessment could be a good avenue to push forward participatory methods. So as you see more policies and laws coming online that mandate impact assessment, we were thinking about how can impact assessment be uh, obligated to do a participatory community-based assessment. So asking who's affected, who's not already in the loop of tech policy decisions, what are communities' questions, and to reshape systems, to redo AI development with respect to community feedback. I got to pilot this with a city government in California, in the city of San Jose, where they were really early stage in thinking about some high-risk use cases for computer vision. And we convinced the city to take that conversation out to the Amigos de Guadalupe Center, to the Vietnamese American Organization, and to organizations that were representing people experiencing homelessness to get feedback in the problem formulation phase of their work. And I think of it as Design for the Margins is a really important resource for participatory AI, because if you think of a curb cut, sure, it might be designed for people using wheelchairs, but it is a resource that serves people with bicycles, people who use canes, baby strollers, so many other people are served by focusing on the needs of those who are least included in tech design. And in our conversations, communities were pointing out road safety concerns, dark areas, reckless driving, and they wanted to shift the conversation as to what AI would be used for to the problems that they were experiencing in their communities. A few takeaways, and then I'll turn it over to our panel. So we know that everyday people are uh, deeply expert on the problems that affect them, and they are prepared to give critical input that will shape and develop AI. Expertise, in our experience, hasn't been a barrier. And if you're looking for resources or methods that could help you bridge that gap, I refer you especially to this Quo et al. Paper, where they use comic book storyboarding to break down key factors in machine learning model inputs to get feedback from residents on an automated decision system used in housing services. And we've been trying to iterate our own approach to this that I was sharing a bit about, called impact engagement. I'd be delighted to talk with you about that offline. So that's what we're thinking about. Those are my questions for you. And without further ado, I would like to bring up first Tina Park from Partnership on AI for her phenomenal work looking at this overall development in AI space. Thanks.
I'm going to move this. The colors are different, right? And you're going to be my timekeeper? Awesome. Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's okay. I'm jet lagged too. I came yesterday afternoon, sometime days. So I apologize if at any point I'm talking too fast or feel a little bit incoherent. I'm having caffeine, so I will be happy to answer more questions during the lunch break. But I'm really excited to be here. There's a lot of familiar faces and hopefully faces that will become familiar. As mentioned, my name is Tina Park. I'm the head of inclusive research and design for Partnership on AI. Just really quickly, About PAI, we are a multi-stakeholder nonprofit organization based in the United States and Canada. We are made up of member organizations, of which several of the organizing committee members are part of. And we work across many different areas, including my own, to make to establish recommendations for the field on how to implement responsible AI. Really, the way that we do it is first we cultivate a community of folks who are thinking about the same problems, but from very different angles. So we try to do this cross-sectorally. So we invite people within the communities from civil society, from academic institutions, media organizations, and industry to come together to really identify what the issues are and sort of what the best approaches to those might be. We try to identify all those ethical tensions that exist when we're thinking about these problems. So in our particular case for this project, really thinking about some of the tensions that arise when you are trying to work with socially marginalized communities, because we know that's not a very straightforward process. And then after a lot of deliberation and learning from the field and learning from the expertise of the folks that we work with, we try to produce resources that can be adopted by the rest of the field. And we try to do this with different audiences in mind. For this particular project, as I'll go into a little bit more deeply, we focused on folks working within the commercial sector, and I'll talk us through why we did that. I did not do this work by myself, so I should not be getting much of the credit. This was developed actually over the course of the last year and a half. We kicked off back in June 2023 with this very excellent group of folks that you can see. Oops, I clicked the wrong one. You can see on the screen, and several of whom I think you'll actually be hearing from throughout the day. So some fantastic peers in the space. Again, they come from academia, civil society, and industry and policy spaces. And we look specifically, especially from our industry partners, for folks who have been grappling with this problem of like, how do they get their organization to think and implement participatory practices for several years, if not decades, and actually have put forward a lot of resources to do this. So we know that in industry, there are many people who are trying to do this and trying to figure it out, but we also knew that there are folks who have been doing this and we can learn a lot from them from, you know, some of the mistakes that they've made along the way, but also some of the hard learnings that they've had in terms of how to interact with the rest of their organization to get these kinds of practices pulled through. Very quickly, fun QR link. If you do want to see the draft guidelines, because they still are in draft form, you can use the bit.ly or you can use the guidelines, the QR code right up there. I should caveat by saying, I think, Meg, you were asking about the roots of like where we're coming from. My background is as a sociologist and as an urban planner. But before that, I think where my roots really started is as a student activist and organizers, working mostly in the era of, in the United States, when there were increasing attacks on affirmative action and heightened Islamophobia. And so a lot of that like multi-ethnic, sort of understanding power and privilege as a student was sort of what has shaped a lot of my professional career. And hopefully that is reflected in the work that I do today. All right, so what were we trying to actually do with this project? As we all probably know, translating high-level principles into everyday organizational practices is really hard. And that's for a lot of different reasons. First off, value statements can be interpreted and understood really differently. One of the first projects that I did for PAI when I started back in 2020 was actually just asking a bunch of AI practitioners, so engineers, UX researchers, sort of the gamut of folks, you know, what do you mean by participation and inclusion? And the number of different responses I got was kind of baffling, but at the same time made a lot of sense because they're really big terms that capture a lot. So they range from anything around like, oh, I work on getting more women and girls into STEM. That was their version of participation and inclusion versus others who are coming, for example, from the UX space, really were thinking about like, how do I do better engagement with different users and clients? And so that's one major challenge, right? Of how do you take something that people understand very differently and actually hone them into practices that we all agree upon are sort of the manifestation of those things. The second thing is that, especially in an organizational context, you're going to have really different sets of values coming up that need to be implemented, and they might actually be in conflict or misaligned with one another. So in our particular case, we're thinking a lot about how industry practitioners might integrate participatory practices into their work. But as we know and was mentioned, sometimes participatory efforts are seen as too costly, and so they might be in conflict with this value of increasing the bottom line and making sure that it doesn't affect profits. The other big issue, especially around organizationally, is that it can be rolled out and implemented really inconsistently. So you might be part of a team that takes this really seriously. You have an excellent manager, and a lot of time and effort is put into doing this work well. And then the team right next door is doing the literal opposite of what you're trying to do, and in some ways might be completely negating your own efforts. And so how do you do this in a way that is consistent across the organization? And then I think especially for our work around AI, the situation is ever changing. The technology itself is changing, which means that we have to really adapt what we do and how we deal with it. What we do for, say, an automated decision-making system that's being used by a local municipality might be really different than what we have to use for generative AI systems that are just a bit more complicated and broad impact. And then, of course, incentives and available resources can really differ across sectors, but also organizations. So what we really aim to do is help practitioners navigate some of the common challenges that come up when you're trying to process in the process of engaging people from socially marginalized communities so that they can remain as authentic and equity-oriented as possible in their efforts. The purpose is not necessarily to come up with a universal system of doing participatory methods, recognizing that really there is no perfect solution or one size fits all that's going to fit every single scenario that people find themselves in. And rather, it's meant to serve as a means to break down some of that complexity that comes up around different stakeholder engagement strategies so that it's a little bit easier and easier to digest as sort of procedures that they can take. And then we're trying to be optimistic as a body, which is really strange for me as an individual because I'm not the most optimistic person, but that it is possible to work within the limitations that arise within these corporate-led stakeholder engagement activities to improve outcomes. But we also want to be very realistic in saying that just because you talk to and engage with different communities doesn't actually mean that you can address all forms of harm that arise from AI systems. Some systems might be inherently harmful, and we have to acknowledge that. And we have to be able to grapple with some of what we're willing to give and what we can get from that process. So one of the things we start with is just trying to emphasize the point that stakeholder engagement can happen across any point in the life cycle, which seems, again, obvious to most folks in this room, but oftentimes isn't discussed. And what we want to do is point out, these are all the different points at which you can be engaging with different stakeholder bodies. So whether it's trying to understand what the market needs are at the very start of a project before you even identify the problem, and having communities work with you to actually identify the problems that they want solved through technology is one. But then, for example, data collection and enrichment are also a point in which you could be working more closely with communities, whether it's the data enrichment workers themselves or with the communities from whom you're taking the data to ensure that that process is more equitable. And we also want to think, all the way through the end around the points when model deprecation happens, right? When we decide to pull something off market, that's also a point in which you should be working with different community members because maybe they are using your system for uses that you weren't as familiar with that is really integral to the way that they do their work, but you wouldn't have ever known because that's not how you specified that model's usage. But these are all points in time when we should be thinking about how are we thinking through the problem. The other thing we want to do through the guidelines is to help break down sort of all those different component parts that I think many of us who have been working in this space for years understand intuitively. And I sort of approached our task force to say, when you're thinking about someone approaching you with a stakeholder engagement plan and you kind of make that face where you're like, that might not work. What are you thinking through, right? What are the different pieces of it? Because I think that is the intuition that a lot of new practitioners are missing, which is they don't understand oh, there needs to be a set of organizational commitments involved to make sure that I'm not the only person doing this. So, are there policies in place from, our C-suite saying hey, we're going to incentivize you as employees to do this. We're going to make sure that you have the budgets necessary to be able to work with different communities. We're going to have transparency mechanisms in place to make sure that the feedback that we get is made available to others, et cetera. There's also pieces around process design, how you're choosing who to speak with, when, at what point in the development process you're iterating that. Even the type of feedback that you're requesting, right? Is it just on the final model? Are you actually asking for input around like other issues that might arise that they identify? Even things like, you know, the relational aspect of what you're constructing with your stakeholder group, the formality of the relationship. Is it something that's like, you know, there's an NDA involved? How is that going to affect the kind of input that you get? And so again, a lot of this is designed to sort of help break all of this down. Tactically speaking, because we're focused on this sort of commercial sector group, which is dealing with a lot of differences in power, both sort of internally and then also with the stakeholders that they want to engage, we thought about how can we make sure that this messaging is getting through to the right people and what messages in particular. And so we focus sort of on 3 layers to the work. So there's one which is for the business leader. This is where we got a lot of input from like practitioners who have been doing this work, where they say like, I keep hitting walls where I can't explain to the people who are making decisions in my organization why this work is important. Can you help us do that advocacy? And so for them, it's really more about what is the role of stakeholder engagement? Why is it important? What are the sort of highlights that you need to understand so that you can be sort of on the same page as your teams that are trying to do this? Trying to keep it really short and pithy, which is not my strength, but thank goodness I have a comms team to work with, just so that they have that sort of resource available. For new practitioners who are actually thinking through deeply, like how they want to learn more and they're eager and they have that time and energy to do it, we want to take them through the whole thing in terms of like what's important about this, who are the different actors and institutions that are part of this process, and go into a lot of the details that many of you are working on so that they have a deeper foundation to the work. But we also recognize that for experienced practitioners, a lot of that is probably unnecessary. And so for them, we're building out a widget that allows you to sort of select different features of your own scenario to help develop guidelines that are just a little bit more specific to your use case. And so that will sort of be more of a checklist just to help you think through, like, did I take these different things into consideration? And it's more as a process to help you understand like where you might just be missing a piece of it, right? It's there to be sort of a sounding board for experienced practitioners. I am done. So I will leave it at that. Thank you. I don't have to stay up here, right? Okay.
Yes, good morning. Good morning. Uh, it's actually my first time in Paris, and I'm very happy to be here, although it's a bit cold compared to where I'm coming from. Right, so my name is Naftali. I'm actually coming from Namibia University of Science and Technology. Just to give a brief talk about the work that we are doing down south. So we actually, our talk is about designing responsible artificial intelligence systems with indigenous communities, where we are actually looking at a participatory approach with 2 indigenous communities in Namibia, particularly the Himba and the San communities. Right, so this is basically about how do I take the AI system from what is happening in the world to actually diverse communities, which are actually not familiar with the concept. So I did not do this work by myself. I did with actually a group of my teammates that I have listed there. All right, so with the advancement in technology and AI is actually, it's a very disruptive field. There's a lot that is happening. We are talking about AI governance. We are talking about how do we make sure that this technology is not, it's actually doing what's intended to do, not instead of just causing harm. But now the question would be, so there's a whole concept of responsible AI, which is a very, emerging field that a lot of researchers are looking into. But the question would be, what does that even mean to a lot of communities that we are working with? I'm sure that a lot of people, when you present this AI technology, they're actually quite excited about using them, right? We are all happy to use our models. We are all happy to use our ChatGPT. We are actually very excited about that. But the question would be, if I have to give this technology to somebody who do not understand AI in particular, how do I present it, right? And that's basically what the work that we are doing is about. Right, so as opposed to the definition of responsible AI, which means we are actually trying to design systems that are trustworthy, that are fair, that are transparency. So we are trying to make sure that this technology is not causing any harm. But the question would be now, what does that mean to a diverse minority or an indigenous community, such as the San and the Himba communities? I'm actually focusing more on this. All right, so we went to these communities and we say, okay, we explained to them what does it mean for a responsible AI system. Then after we actually explained to them, they actually asked us quite a number of questions to say, okay, so this is what you guys are telling us it is, but this is what we want it to be, right? Then they are saying, okay, we actually want, for us to trust that's a responsible AI system, we want a system that respects our cultural heritage. That was number one. We want a system that is actually aligns with our cultural value, which respects what we do on the ground. We don't just want the technology that comes and change the ways of our living, for example. Right, so these communities have quite a number of challenges. Number one, their heritage is actually being wiped out by most of the technology. Then we have a lot of issues about social economic challenges, such as lack of education, lack of health facilities, and all that, and also lack of infrastructure, right? The one thing that they actually pointed out is that they actually need for a culturally relevant AI systems that they need to work with. Then the second issue is that they want this system to integrate. They want this system to integrate with their values, right? As I pointed out at the beginning. So now the question would be, how do we bridge this gap from moving from what is actually happening in theory to bring it on the ground with these two communities? So that's where we actually look at different case studies where we actually where we involve these communities in developing these systems. Where number one, we're actually trying to establish the aspect of trust. How do I bring this new system to the community and make sure that they will actually be willing to work with it? How do I establish that trust in the system with the community? So that's where we actually bring in the issue of participatory design, where we actually try to involve the community throughout the whole development cycle. Right, so this is it's actually quite a lot of work, but in this case, I'm basically just summarizing what we have done since I'm only given 10 minutes. Right, so the two case studies that we looked at, we first developed something called a smart hydroponic systems. So this is basically a system where the community is supposed to grow food with a little bit of soil, I mean with no soil at all, right? But now, so we bring this system to these two communities. For example, the Himba community, this is a community that actually they depend on most of their staple food is basically meat and milk, right? Then we brought them a system that actually where they can use it to plant vegetables. Guess what happened? So this community said, what are we going to do with this system? As we don't eat vegetables. Then, so what we did when we circled back is that, oh, okay, instead of just shoving this technology in their hands, we should actually listen to them. Then we say, okay, what if we use this system to grow grass for you to feed your animals? Then they say, okay, if that's the case, we'll work with it. So then we involve these two communities to actually design that smart hydroponic system. Then the second one is about preserving their cultural heritage. So they don't want their heritage to die out in the digital world. So that's actually where we did that with visual realities. Then the last one is it's actually part of a bigger project that we are working with, where we actually have an issue of high school dropout among the San communities. And the main cause is actually language barrier. So in that in mind, what we are doing here is we are actually designing, we are co-designing what is called a resilient app. So it's basically an application that is meant to help these youth being resilient, be able to actually adapt when they're experiencing challenges when they are going to school, right? So that's what we are actually co-designing with them. All right, so in details, the smart hydroponic system. So like I've said, we actually integrated these two systems in the two communities, right? So in one of the communities, the system was very successful, which is now the Sun communities, where first we actually set up the system, they started growing vegetable with it, they started harvesting, they were very happy about the system. But now the next aspect of it was, how do we establish trust in this system? So in order to do that, we first started with co-designing sessions with the community, where we involve the community first in, we understand what do they want. After they actually have noticed the system is working, they are growing vegetable and they're happy with it. Then they ask, what do they want? So the community pointed out that we actually want this system to be transparent. Number one, we only trust the system if we understand how it works. Then we ask, how do you want to understand the system? Then we came now to an idea where we came up with something called a transparent app. So they actually want an application that tell them what is really happening with the system. If there's any sort of failure, how do we go about that, right? So, and again, they want this system to actually resemble what their culture is about. So that's where we came up with the two AI systems together with the community. And if you look at some of these drawings, actually the one that's actually designing the interface. They are the one that says, this is how we want the interface to look like. It must represent our culture and so forth. So then from there, we actually designed the two AI assistant chatbot, which actually tells them about if anything happens in the system, is it caused by lack of nutrients? What do we need to do and so forth? Then with the Himba community, so if you look at the erupting of generative models, so now there's actually this AI model that actually where you can get a video from a prompt. You can tell the model to give you something, let's say a video of somebody doing something, right? So and they're actually thinking about using this in virtual realities. So what we did with these two communities, we actually designed two virtual reality worlds. So one of them is it's actually the one that respect their values. Then the other one is just an AI generated virtual reality. Then so again, we are involving these two communities in the whole process. First, we do all the co-design session where we show them probes of how everything looks like. Then we let them actually test the two systems and compare. So in the end, when these two communities look at these two systems, the first system, which actually respected their values, which we have been working on for years, that was fine, and they were happy with it. However, the one that was AI generated, they actually made it not to preserve their culture. So in other words, it actually indicates that in the long run, their animals are going to die out and so forth. So in such a way, it's actually quite not responsible in a way. Then lastly, coming to the resilient app, again, we did the core design session with the youth. Then we asked them, what does it mean for this system to be relatable to you? How can you use it to help yourself? Then, so that's where we actually did a prototype with something called a smart mirror, where the youth, when they're in distress, they can actually engage with this system. Then the system gives them sort of motivational inspiration of how they can cope with their challenges, right? All right, in conclusion, so participatory AI actually matters. And what's important is that we must always involve the communities that where we are designing the technology for. Otherwise, it will not actually be viable for them. So instead of just coming up with a technology that is predefined, then I just shove it in their head and I let them use it, that will not make sense. And again, while we are doing this, we should also try to address challenges that are happening on the ground. Especially with these two communities that we are working with, they're actually in remote areas of Namibia where there is actually no internet access. So we basically try to design systems that are user-friendly to them, that they can also use them offline. And looking at the way forward, we are actually thinking about extending this type of case studies and also try to come up with tangible solution that tackles major challenges. So this was basically just a look into how do we translate from policy to what is happening on the ground, and how can we move forward from there. All right, thank you.
But may I invite some of you to try to push in the middle of the room, because we have some newcomers arriving and they have to sit on the side, which is so yeah, please. Thank you very much.
All good. No worries. Shall I give it 2 minutes for people to? Okay. Yeah, there's movement now. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we're tight on schedule, and I do have a fairly long presentation for 10 minutes, so I will literally zoom through it, unintended for colleagues online. So good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous, à toutes. My name is Jeremy Boy. I'm the lead data scientist of the UNDP UN Development Program Accelerator Lab Network. And I'm going to talk about some work that we did with the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. It will maybe resonate a little bit with things that you've heard already. Any relationship with what was presented about what is done in the Sciences Po School of Public Affairs is fortuitous at this point, but hopefully not in the long run. And so we did some work on developing a framework for conducting national dialogues on frontier technologies. A little word on the Accelerator Lab Network, which I'm part of, where 89 social innovation labs in 113 countries, or servicing 113 countries, were embedded within the UNDP system of country offices, so physically present in 89 countries, but servicing 113. And what we provide to the organization is a sort of bottom-up R&D capacity. You've heard it, I mean, you're all familiar with this idea that those who are closest to the problem are those who know the problems the best. What we try to bring to the organization is learning from and with people to inform global development priorities within our organization and member states. This is not just UNDP work. This was done, as I mentioned, with a cohort of Columbia SIPA students and their professor, who unfortunately is not on this photo, but kudos to them. They did the bulk of the work. This is, it was a great team. Now, participation in our space concretely boils down, well, is, I guess, embodied in a few very recent events and documents. Last year, this probably you're all aware of, there was a global digital compact that was agreed to by all UN member states during the Summit of the Future. And one of the action items in the global digital compact is a call to enhance global governance of AI. This echoes the report that was put out roughly at the same time of the UN Secretary General's AI advisory body, entitled Governing AI for Humanity. I'm going to go quickly here because I think everyone's on the same page. The question of governing AI, the question of the narrative and so on is who gets to shape that narrative, who gets to contribute to establishing these models of governance. So what we set out to do was build a framework that we could, ideally, we've started, but we're not full scale yet, but instantiate through all the labs that we have in all the countries in which we are present through our network. And so we were looking, or we were envisaging inclusive dialogues on 3 levels, sort of 3 concentric circles. The outer one being, of course, speaking or collecting voices from those who are not often heard in these global dialogues, so people from the global majority, especially in countries that might not be as digitally developed or as AI ready. There are many AI readiness assessments going around. Then second concentric circle, follow inclusive, principles on data collection and so on. How do we collect that information? How do we distribute the information? Give it back also to communities. And then intentionally, the last circle, the very central one, make the conversations themselves accessible to people. Because it's all good to, convene a whole bunch of different stakeholders, but if you don't have an elevator, then some people might not be able to come up. I mean, that's a random example, but yeah. And then our main inspiration for this was another global campaign that was done in preparation of the Sustainable Development Goals, so in the early 2010s, called the Future We Want campaign. And this set out to collect the voices of people around the world, indeed, on the future that they wanted to then inform the conversations that were happening at the global level for the Sustainable Development Goals. And there were two aspects that were really important to us, this idea of comparability between groups and countries, but also maintaining some kind of local specificity. So focusing also on what makes the differences between these different countries and groups. At our level, it's mainly countries. So I'm not going to go into much detail about the framework that we developed. Essentially, at a high level here, there are three segments to it. The first one is leveling. And I think Naftali gave a very interesting presentation on, indeed, how do you go and talk about AI to people who don't know and in many cases don't really care about AI? And so how do you bring them in? How do you anchor the conversation and so on? The second one is capturing sort of general perspective. So once you've anchored the conversation, once you know whatever, or people have agreed on what they're going to talk about related to AI, which is again an evasive concept, what is their perspective? How do they see the future? How do they see it affecting them, in the future? And the last part is focusing specifically on the different stakeholder groups that might be present and going into further detail on how that might be contextually relevant or what are the contextual factors that might come into play. So to test this framework out and to refine it, we conducted 2 pilots in the Kingdom of Morocco and the Republic of Paraguay, where we have labs. So 2 countries that have very different sort of AI readinesses according to multiple assessments. And in these 2 countries, we tested a whole number of different modalities for consulting different groups. In Morocco, it was entirely focus group discussions, but with a very wide range of different stakeholders, a lot of vulnerable groups, and across the country. So not just in one city, it was in 6 different cities. And in Paraguay, we tested a whole range of different types of modalities to get different groups, socioeconomic backgrounds, and so on, based on location and so on. In total, we spoke to over 200 people, and we had, I guess, 38 different types of sessions, if you consider a street survey a kind of session. So I want to jump into the results, because I think even though these are preliminary results, this was a pilot. Again, part of the work here was to refine the framework itself. But some of the results that we're seeing are interesting and I think resonate also with the previous presentation. So in this idea of going in and speaking to people about AI who may or may not be aware of it, again, AI is an evasive concept. There's the famous saying of statistics is done on the blackboard, machine learning is done in Python, AI is done in PowerPoint. So how do you engage people and make it concrete, So what we paid attention to in Morocco is what are people using as proxies or converging towards when they're talking about AI? So it can be different applications. So ChatGPT, because of the global influence of the news right now, is the one that came up in every consultation. So here the axes is out of the 6 consultations that happened in Morocco, whether these different items were mentioned or discussed. So Zapier and Photomat, other applications. Then you have sort of grouping of areas in which AI is applied, so social media, research, automation, or fields, if you will. And then there are more specific techniques. Some conversations go a bit more technical, talking about pattern detection and the impact of deepfakes and so on. Then we paid attention to the themes that were discussed. And so education comes up a lot, obviously, both integrating AI into curricula, but also creating curricula specifically around AI, so training a future workforce ready for AI. Privacy, security, integrity came up a lot. Jobs, indeed, because all of these are rather global, rather prominent topics, creativity related to that. Only one conversation brought up environment. The one quick thing that I'll say on this is what's interesting also is the negative side. So, or not negative, what we're not seeing in this. Very little conversation on infrastructure typically. So moving through the framework here, going on to general perceptions and switching to Paraguay, what the team did in Paraguay is they took all the transcriptions of the different interviews that they did. And so again, they had a number of different modalities, and they coded sentiment on the different verbatims that they collected, and disaggregated that according to gender, according to geographic location in which some of the consultations or interviews took place, and according to education level. Here, again, to be taken with a pinch of salt because it's not as, a representative sample of the population and so on. But we see a trend towards men being more positive towards AI than women. One really interesting thing that they did in the street surveys is go to different locations as proxies for socioeconomic background. So they went to the corporate zone where presumably you have more affluent, higher income people who are generally more positive and see more opportunities in AI than in lower income areas like street markets or rural areas where people are a bit more reserved. And finally, the one on the right here, this is across all the consultations in Paraguay. There's a quite clear correlation between level of education and perception of possibly benefiting from AI somewhere down the line. To compare the two, and on a different question here, one thing that was really interesting was on who do you perceive as responsible for mitigating the risks that might be associated with AI? So in Morocco, I'll start on the right here. Yes, developers were mentioned in many cases, but what came out, sorry, in many of the consultations, or in the focus groups, but what came out primarily was a focus on the user. The users are responsible for, or perceived to be responsible for the good and safe use of AI. In Paraguay, somewhat similar, but also obviously public sector, and very little or much less on the private sector. So it's much less up to corporations to be responsible for the AI that they're producing than the public sector for governing it. I'll very quickly go through this because, yes, it resonates a lot with what Naftali mentioned before. This is going a bit, zooming in further, I guess, into the more qualitative insights. But in Paraguay, strong concerns about language because it's a bilingual country. One of the languages is primarily oral. So there's very little written material to be able to train NLP, well, large language models on. There's a lack of talent and a desire for more AI in curricula. That was both in Morocco and in Paraguay. In Paraguay, it was particularly interesting because there's also a fear of labor migration, so work talent leaving the country, or if they stay in the country, working for outside companies. And the last one that I think is really interesting, and indeed, Naftali, you mentioned this as well, the adherence to cultural values. So in Morocco, that was particularly strong, and the way that translated in Paraguay was tensions around colonial perceptions of AI. So in both cases, it's this idea that AI is something ultimately coming from the outside that's kind of been imposed on these groups, and how do you deal with that? And two quotes just to anchor that further. When technology is imported without knowledge of how it will be useful in the local context, the technology does not live up to the expectations which foreign sellers had ramped it up to be. This comes from an official, like from the government in Paraguay. On the Moroccan side, it's important that when we use AI, we adhere to Moroccan values. One of the risks is changing or undermining our norms and culture. That was very quick. This is all published in the framework. There's a background report that explains the design and development of the framework, goes into a bit more detail about the insights that we generated through the 2 pilot studies. And I want to finish by giving credit to the great team of students, their professor, all the names are listed there, to our colleagues in Morocco and in Paraguay. And I want to leave this sort of slogan at the end, maybe to open up for the panel discussion as well. But I come from, I'll say, more of a tech background. And the concept of democratizing technology is everywhere. And I think there's a need to reclaim that term of democratizing. So moving away from democratizing technology to being more democratic about the development and deployment of technology. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. I know you're feeling fired up. You might have some questions. I'd like you to please bring them here to the microphone. And Anna, is this a question from online? Oh, a comment. If yeah, who has a question for the panel? This is yeah, okay.
Please. Hello, my name is Caitlin Bentley. I'm from King's College. It was lovely to see such diverse presentations, and I just wanted to pick up some of the points that you started to raise there about the impact of AI on our lives and society. And I found overall that many of the presentations took this inherently instrumental view of AI, where we're kind of just seeing what are the ways where we can implement AI in a participatory or inclusive way, when some of the more fundamental aspects of participatory research around the politics of participation and really having a voice in the impacts these technologies are having on our lives. I know there's also, sorry, I'll shut up soon, but I know there's also like a track about power and resistance, but I'm questioning whether we can really separate these two out, and how can we do better as a community to integrate these more political aspects of participation into participatory AI research?
Okay, that's a really good point. And through the guidelines that we provide, we do emphasize that saying no to technology is one of the outcomes that, as practitioners, they should be prepared to grapple with. Now, again, the audience for the guidelines in this particular case are corporate or commercial sector practitioners. And so the question becomes like, how much can you serve as an advocate for the communities if they do say no within the companies, right? And in many instances, practitioners might be on a team where they don't have that much control. And so how do you operate within those conditions, I think is something that we want to bring as a question to the practitioners to think about more deeply, because right now they may not, right? They just sort of think of it as, well, we have to do this anyways. And we want them to sort of start to have good dialogues with community members to say like, well, do you actually have to build that? And that's a big part of the opening that we want to create by advising them to make space for those no's to happen. Because that is a really important part, is to not assume that every issue requires an AI solution, and that is a fundamental idea that needs to be disrupted.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. Yeah, from my experience working with the indigenous communities, it's always an issue around what does this technology first mean? You first have to explain to them, and not always that they will be willing to work with what you are giving them. That's why from our work, what we had to do is we actually had to first sort of involve them in the whole process. And that actually caused them to be a little bit open to AI. But at the beginning, there were quite a lot of resistance. And those are actually quite a number of challenges that we always have to deal with from the get-go.
Thank you. I mean, I fully agree with what was said, and indeed, going into these types of consultations, one of the things that I was hoping to see or hear was indeed the sort of blank pushback. We don't want this. And keeping the opportunity open for that. As far as I know, because I wasn't in situ for all the consultations, it didn't come up specifically. But I want to offer maybe the flip side of that question. What's driving the incentive to have AI everywhere all at the same time and scale it massively? Beginning of an answer is economic. PwC put out a report back in 2017 and updates the figure every so often. Right now, it's estimated that by 2030, AI would contribute 15 trillion to the global economy. Everyone wants a share of that. And so rather than, I mean, it's indeed definitely important to be open to the possibility that indeed AI is not the answer and not the solution, and any tech in general is maybe not the answer. But it's also important to look at what's driving the push for AI to be the answer everywhere.
Did we have another question? Great. Here, did you give me one of the mic?
I think
Have a mic.
I've got the mic. Well, I know I've got the mic. My question is possibly not totally a question. My background is education, skills, training, and employment over 50 odd years. My questions are, how are we going to ensure that there is trust in the integrity of the data that's used? Particularly, I've been aware that the development of this new Chinese system, if we're going to trust and develop things in the context of AI, we have to have trust in the data. How are we going to manage that in an international sense? Is there any progress on that? So integrity is at the heart of it. But I think my other slight dilemma in this, having seen many jobs disappear over the last 50 years, is, are the academically able amongst us, which everyone here potentially represents, aware that our jobs are actually the most at risk in this? And surely we've all learnt from COVID that there are now difficulties in many societies getting people to do practical, down-to-earth jobs. And I was fascinated by what's happening in Namibia. Thank you for that presentation. How are we going to grapple with the broader aspects of this? Because that's at the heart of whether or not people will adapt to, fight against, utilize effectively AI. So I'm feeling a lot of dilemmas in this alongside excitement.
I'm going to take one more question and then you answer both.
Is this working? Thank you. Thank you for your presentations. They were fascinating. My name is Lydia Velkova. I lead an agency that helps to do, I guess, what you call impact research. So we engage people and we look at evidence in order to make actual impact on the ground. And I had a question for Tina and for Jeremy. Tina, I was really curious. In my day-to-day work, we work with big corporations and we try to get them to be responsible. And my experience in the research we've done is that no matter how many guidelines we try and put out there, the adoption of those, especially at the highest C-suite level, is very slim, and usually financial incentives make it to the top of the agenda. So what's your experience? I'd be really curious to know from the partnership on AI. And then for Jeremy, a lot of the engagements that we do require us to recruit people based on interest in contributing to topics, and I was very curious about learning more about how you manage to increase interest in something that is such a nebulous idea for people to contribute their thoughts and insights on. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for that interesting question. Right. So the issue of data privacy, it's actually quite a big issue around, I think, around the whole world. Eh? But the funny thing is, when it comes to the global south, I think like in Europe and America, there's quite a lot of guidelines in place in terms of, data privacy. How do we make sure that this data is protected? And we are not just using people's data and, nothing comes out of that. And there's a lot of concern about, how do I protect myself? But now when it comes to the global south, it's more like there's a case where people are a little bit, that is the list of their concern, so to say. It's all about the question of how will this technology help us, right? But that does not mean from the policy point of view, our governments, they are also putting these measures into place because they're also concerned about this, right? And they also have to obey to the guidelines that are set by the world. And that's why we are also starting to look deep into how do we make sure that this technology is actually, it's not just gonna run wild. There is some sort of guideline in place. That's why we have a Data Protection Act that our governments are actually putting into place. Then we have AI Regulation Act that are also, although that's still at an early stage, but we're actually moving toward making sure that from you as a researcher to a corporate company, how do you obey these regulations where you don't just go and take people's data and actually use it however you want, right?
Looking because I'm worried about how much time we have. Okay, I will be quick. I will start with the data trust question because I'm fascinated by this myself. And the question I would pose is, what is gained by having a tremendous amount of trust as opposed to amount of unhealthy distrust? Because at the end of the day, data are very poor proxies for human behavior. And so what do we gain by constantly negotiating how accurate they are and what they're actually representing? And so I'm curious what kind of system we would develop if we sort of leaned into that more to say the data is probably not good and the data has a temporality to it. that is only good for a certain amount of time to capture a certain place and moment and experience. And so how do we grapple with that ephemerality of the data itself? And then again, with the mistrust part, like what kinds of protections can we put in place given that data is prone to abuse and misuse and things like that? So at the end of the day, if we have to really protect the people who are behind the data, what would that take? And so I like to think of it as like, should we be leaning in towards data trust and having people presume that they can trust different entities to use that data well? Or should we be setting up a system that's kind of the opposite of that? To the other question around experience working with tech companies, I always say I'm very lucky that I get to work with the folks who have already bought into this. And so you'll notice from the industry organizations that I partnered with, they're the ones who have already made the long-term investments. So they have like teams that have not gone anywhere for the past 10 years. They're well-funded. They're doing really interesting research internally. They're being given access to ask these questions of their colleagues and like really explore and do some meta-analysis around what their own teams are doing. And so I think in some ways that gives me a little bit of optimism that like even though there is a trend right now and we're seeing this dangerously so in the United States with a lot of companies coming out, for example, against DEI policies, whatever that actually means, you also see companies that are doubling down and saying, we're not, come what may, we are not actually going to shift ourselves from these different kinds of policies and these different initiatives that try to make for a more equitable and more welcoming space for not just our employees, but the kind of products that we develop. And so not every company is good, but not every company is terrible. I think part of the guidelines is trying to set up employees to maybe push their own companies to do more. The guidelines themselves are oriented around sort of some of the larger tech companies, but the hope there too is that can we reach startups where like they don't have a culture of this yet and we can actually reach them? Thank you for the question.
Indeed, thank you for the questions. Also reacting to the question on trust first. So within UNDP, not specifically the Accelerated Labs network that I'm part of, but within the organization, there is an ongoing partnership with the Italian presidency of the G7 to establish an AI hub. Trust is one of the main dimensions or one of the main initiatives that's being run out of the AI hub. So it's a big question. Teams within our organization are working on that. I can't really speak to it specifically because it's not my area. The one thing I will say, though, from a more technical perspective, trust, as you mentioned it, models coming from different countries with different, things that might be or might not be censored and so on, is a really important concern when you're considering general purpose AI. So these sort of, the race towards AGI. And there's also a sort of parallel movement towards more frugal, more edge AI. So with much more specific models where the data is much more controlled and for much more specific application areas. And so that can highly increase the trust as well, I believe. On the question on how do we recruit people for these kinds of consultations, so we have the advantage of the lab network, the Accelerated Lab Network has been around for now 5 years. The labs have had a priority to work on or with grassroots initiatives in their countries, contrary to traditional UNDP approaches, which is very much with government. And so the labs have quite deep connections with activist groups, with grassroots innovators, with, a whole range of different parts of civil society because they work on different things, obviously, than just AI. And it's through those connections as well that at least these 2 consultations were run.
I'm afraid that's all the time that we have. I'd like to please thank our incredible panel.